The rain hammered relentlessly against the glass wall outside, its rhythm echoing the strange tension building within me. I found myself lost in thought, staring at the slick city skyline while my phone buzzed softly on the counter. A quick message appeared. "I'll be there soon." My younger brother, just 22, fresh out of college and already an enigma, seemed wrapped up in his own aspirations and restlessness. It had been ages since we last saw each other, months in fact. Our busy schedules and separate lives served as the typical excuses. We reached out occasionally, whenever the silence stretched too thin. Yet lately, I had been missing him in a way that gnawed at me, as if something unfinished lingered between us. Now he was making the trip all the way here, almost like he sensed my unease. Setting my phone down, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the rain-specked glass. I looked older and somewhat distant. At 26, I had grown accustomed to solitude in this sprawling city, a place that felt both expansive and stifling. But a strange warmth tugged at my heart, reminding me of all those shared memories and familiar arguments from our childhood, moments that now seemed so far away. Just then, the doorbell rang, jolting me from my thoughts. I inhaled deeply and crossed the cold wooden floor to answer the door. Expecting to see my brother, the same shy and slightly disheveled kid I remembered, I opened it to find someone entirely different. He stood there, radiating confidence, his calm smile almost startling. His gaze, sharp and curious, glinted with something I couldn't quite identify, something new. "Hey," he greeted, pulling me into a hug that felt surprisingly brief, as though he were holding back emotions. "Missed you." His voice, deeper and more resonant than I remembered, carried a weight that made me scrutinize his expression. Yet all I found was his usual warmth. Perhaps I was overthinking it. After all, months had passed, and people do evolve. Still, there was an air of change. We moved into the kitchen, and while I busied myself making tea, I couldn't help stealing glances at him over my shoulder. He surveyed the room with an almost reverent intensity, his hands resting on the counter, absorbing the surroundings as if everything were fresh and new. It was peculiar. I had never seen him observe my home like that before. When our eyes met, I quickly looked away, feeling a little foolish. "So, have you been up to anything interesting?" I asked, trying to dispel the odd tension hanging in the air. "More or less the usual," he replied, but his lack of detail intrigued me. There was a calmness in his voice, a deliberate distance, as if he were weighing each word before speaking. His gaze roamed the room again, lingering on the walls, the shelves, and the books scattered across the coffee table. Finally, his eyes settled on me, and I felt a tightness under his scrutiny. "The place looks nice, different from what I imagined," he commented. "Thanks," I responded, but my voice felt hollow. He'd visited a few times before, but never seemed to notice those details. His words felt strange, as if he were analyzing everything with an intensity that was almost unsettling. Turning away, I focused on arranging the teacups, attempting to fill the uncomfortable silence that had fallen between us. "So," I began, pouring hot water over the tea leaves and letting the steam swirl up between us, "what prompted you to come all the way here? It's not exactly a short trip." He shrugged, briefly averting his gaze, and I thought for a moment he might remain silent. But then he looked back at me, a mix of warmth and something undefinable on his face. "I wanted to see you." Those 3 simple words struck me harder than I expected. I swallowed, feeling a twist of emotions I couldn't quite put into words. He was just my brother. We had been close for years. So, why did his presence feel so charged? As if there were unspoken thoughts hanging between us, waiting to be voiced. We carried our steaming cups into the living room, and as we sank onto the couch, I felt a prickling unease creep back in. He settled comfortably into the cushions, at ease in my space, yet there was an edge to him, something both familiar and distant, that compelled me to observe him more closely. Our eyes met, his expression inscrutable, and we sat there in silence for a moment, listening to the rain drumming steadily against the window. Breaking the silence, he leaned forward, narrowing his eyes in a way that felt almost confrontational. "You look different," he said quietly, curiosity tinged with something deeper beneath his words.
Differently how?
I asked, forcing a casual tone, though his comment sent a tremor through me. He hesitated, as if deciding how to respond, then shook his head with a slight smile. "Just different." It was a vague, strange comment that hung between us, filling the silence with an unspoken tension. I felt my cheeks warm, unsure why his words unsettled me. Before I could respond, he turned his gaze away, breaking the intensity of the moment. "Do you remember that storm a few summers back?" he asked suddenly, his tone shifting to nostalgia. I nodded, relieved by the change of topic. "Yeah, you were convinced the power was going to go out. Remember how you kept that flashlight by your bed for weeks afterward?" He laughed, shaking his head. "You exaggerate. But I do recall how you insisted we sit together in the hallway just in case." As he spoke, the tension began to dissipate, and warmth flowed in, replacing the earlier discomfort as we reminisced. We slipped into the comfortable banter of our past, stories spilling out like pages from a shared book, and I almost managed to forget the strange undercurrent that had followed him through the door. Yet, despite the ease of our conversation, that feeling lingered, just out of reach. The way he looked at me, his gaze lingering a moment too long, his words meticulously chosen. It all felt intentional, as if he were waiting for something significant, and I couldn't shake the sense that whatever it was could shift everything. For now, though, I chose to ignore it, hoping it was just the weight of too much time apart. The following morning, a light drizzle began anew, casting a grayish hue over the streets as we stepped out of my building. With no particular plan in mind, we wandered through the city, talking about everything and nothing at all. I noticed how he had grown quieter. He was less the playful little brother I remembered and more of an introspective, almost enigmatic figure walking beside me. There was something about him that felt untouchable, as though he held secrets, fragments of himself he was reluctant to share. Our footsteps echoed softly against the damp streets. Eventually, we found ourselves in front of the old city library, a place we used to visit on weekends as children, losing ourselves in endless rows of books and tales from worlds we had yet to explore. On a whim, I suggested we go inside, an impulsive choice that felt oddly fitting, like revisiting a long-buried part of ourselves. He agreed, and as we stepped into the quiet, musty space, a wave of nostalgia washed over me. The library was dimly lit, shadows pooling in the corners, and I could feel the dampness from outside still clinging to us. The familiar scent of aged paper and polished wood enveloped me, granting a momentary sense of peace. We wandered along the aisles, moving silently, our fingers grazing the spines of books as if trying to reconnect with memories of the past. I stole glances at him, curious about what thoughts were swirling behind that intense, distant expression. At one point, I paused in the poetry section. My fingers brushed over the covers until I picked up an old volume that sparked memories from years ago, a collection of poems we had once laughed at, far too young to grasp their deeper meanings. He noticed the book I was holding and raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smile breaking through his usual guarded demeanor. "Still reading this stuff?" he asked softly, leaning against the shelf. I shrugged, a bit embarrassed as I felt my cheeks warm. "I guess I never outgrew it." He stepped closer, glancing over the pages with a new perspective. "You were so obsessed with this," he reminisced. "I remember you reading those lines aloud, like they were spells or something." There was a lightness in his voice, a teasing warmth that transported me back to those simpler times. I smiled back at him. "You were always the one rolling your eyes and pretending not to care." "I cared," he replied, his tone suddenly serious as his gaze lingered on me. I looked down, feeling an unexpected pang in my chest. The silence that enveloped us felt heavy and charged, as if the air were thick with unspoken words, like the moment before a storm. I could sense his presence closer than it had been in ages, and something inside me tightened. Then, in an instant that felt surreal, we moved closer together. Before I could comprehend what was happening, our lips met in a brief kiss, an unexpected slip into something neither of us had anticipated. It felt like a spark, small yet powerful enough to jolt me back to reality. The distance between us widened almost immediately, the tension snapping as we pulled away. My heart raced, and I became acutely aware of every inch separating us, every breath we took. His face was unreadable, and I couldn't bring myself to meet his gaze for more than a fleeting second. The room around us seemed to expand, the silence growing heavier. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible, laced with what sounded like regret. He reached up, as if to touch my shoulder, but his hand hovered midair before falling back to his side. He swallowed, looking away, and I could see the conflict swirling in his eyes. My mind raced, flooded with confusion, disbelief, and emotions I couldn't quite name. The memory of that moment lingered on my skin, an invisible mark that wouldn't fade. I wanted to say something, to ease the strangeness of it all, but the words wouldn't come. I stood there, staring down at the book in my hands as if it held the answers I couldn't find within myself. After what felt like an eternity, he stepped back, sliding his hands into his pockets and casting his eyes downward. "We should probably go," he suggested. I nodded, barely managing a response. It felt like the most logical course of action, even though nothing about the moment felt sensible. We exited the library in silence, the sound of our footsteps echoing through the narrow aisles, each step a reminder of what had just transpired. The city welcomed us back with the same gentle drizzle, but now it felt colder, more intrusive. I turned away from him, not ready to meet his eyes or confront the swirling questions between us. My mind struggled to rationalize what had happened, to frame it in a way that wouldn't disrupt our bond. We had always been close. Surely, this was just a momentary lapse, a mistake born from vulnerability that would never repeat itself. But despite my attempts to convince myself, the feeling lingered, clinging to me like the dampness of the rain. He remained silent as we walked back, our quiet punctuated only by the soft patter of rain against our umbrellas. When we reached my building, he hesitated at the entrance, and for a fleeting second, I thought he might say something, anything, to break the tension. Instead, he offered a brief nod, his expression a mix of unease and uncertainty. "I'll see you inside," he murmured before slipping into the building. Just like that, he disappeared, leaving me alone with the weight of that brief, unspoken moment between us. I lingered outside for a moment, my mind spinning, my emotions a tangled mess. The rain continued to drizzle down, cold and relentless. I took a deep breath, hoping it would steady my racing heart. But it didn't help. The day after the library incident, the air between us was thick with tension, marked by lingering silence and sidelong glances. I longed to say something to explain or even laugh it off, but the right words eluded me. He seemed to sense my turmoil, giving me space while maintaining a neutral, easygoing demeanor as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. Later that afternoon, in a bid to shake off the awkwardness, he suggested we do something memorable. "Let's hike up Springwater Mountain," he said, grinning as if it were the simplest idea in the world. "Springwater Mountain?" I raised an eyebrow at him. "That's more than just a hike, you know." "Come on," he urged. His eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. "You're always the one dragging me on adventures. Are you too old for that now?" I chuckled, pretending to be offended, but despite the lingering unease from yesterday, I felt my reservations beginning to melt away. The prospect of our little getaway filled me with a rush of excitement, as if we were about to escape the burdens of reality, even if only for a few hours. "All right then," I replied, rolling my eyes. "But don't be surprised if I slow you down." The drive to Springwater Mountain was brief, barely an hour, and we filled the time talking about everything except what had transpired between us. We focused on safe subjects like his plans after graduation, the quirky characters he'd encountered at his new job, and funny anecdotes from our childhood. By the time we reached the mountain trailhead, I had nearly convinced myself that everything was back to normal. But as we began our ascent up the steep, winding path, it quickly became clear that this wasn't going to be the leisurely hike I had imagined. The trail was narrow and rugged, littered with rocks jutting out at odd angles. Within the first hour, I felt that familiar burning sensation creeping at my calves. My brother, however, moved with surprising agility, barely pausing to catch his breath as he navigated the uneven terrain. "Are you serious?" I muttered after yet another steep incline, stopping to regain my breath. "Do you ever get tired?" He turned back, a playful grin spreading across his face. "We've only just started. Don't tell me you're already giving up." "Easy for you to say," I shot back, grimacing as I stretched my weary legs. "You're the one who hasn't taken a break," he teased, shrugging as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "But if you're going to quit, I'll understand." "Oh, please," I replied, rolling my eyes even though my legs were already protesting. "I'm not quitting." With every step, my muscles felt heavier, and my breathing became increasingly labored. He maintained his pace, moving ahead with the same determination he displayed from the start, only glancing back occasionally to make sure I was still in tow. While I appreciated that he didn't push me to go faster, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of irritation at how effortlessly he navigated the trail. I wondered if he even felt tired at all. 3 hours in, I was almost convinced he was a superhero. My legs were in a state of exhaustion I hadn't felt in years, and every step was a battle of sheer willpower. But somehow, I forced myself to keep going, refusing to give him the satisfaction of giving up halfway up the mountain. Finally, we reached a small clearing near the summit, and the sky was painted in stunning hues of pink and orange. The view unfolded before us like a breathtaking canvas of mountains and valleys that seemed to stretch endlessly. I sank down onto a rock, my legs trembling beneath me.
"See?
"Worth it, right?" he said, grinning as he admired the landscape. "Ask me again when my legs start functioning again," I muttered, too worn out to even attempt to smile. I rubbed my sore calves, feeling the sharp ache intensify with every touch. I couldn't believe he was still standing, barely breaking a sweat. For a moment, we sat in silence. The tension from the previous day was replaced by a calm that only accompanies shared fatigue. It felt like a truce, a temporary escape from the strange reality that had settled over us. Yet, amid that silence, I felt a strange longing to ask him what this was all about.
Why?
He seemed to be testing me, pushing me to my limits. As the sun dipped below the mountains, we started our descent, which surprisingly felt easier on my legs. Even though exhaustion had settled deep in my bones, the drive home was quiet. I found myself drifting in and out of sleep, lulled by the soft hum of the engine and the fading light of sunset. The next morning, I woke up to an ache so intense it felt like my legs had turned to stone. Even moving my toes sent sharp jolts of pain shooting at my calves, and I groaned, struggling to sit up. When I tried to stand, my knees buckled, sending me crashing back onto the bed, clutching my legs. A knock on the door interrupted my misery, and before I could respond, he peeked in, grinning at the sight of me sprawled out and wincing. "Good morning, mountain warrior," he teased, leaning against the doorframe with crossed arms. "Oh, don't start," I groaned, pulling the blanket over my head in an attempt to hide my embarrassment. "I'm not even sure I can walk." He laughed and crossed the room to sit at the edge of my bed. "You really didn't pace yourself. 3 hours without a single break." I shot back, peeking out from beneath the blanket. "Who does that?" He shrugged as if it were nothing out of the ordinary. "I thought you'd keep up." I rolled my eyes, but despite the soreness radiating from my legs, a small smile crept onto my face. For a moment, I forgot about the strange tension lingering between us, and it felt as if we were kids again, laughing over silly challenges and daring each other to push just a little harder. But then he fell silent, his gaze dropping as if searching for the right words. The light, playful energy between us began to shift, and I felt the weight of yesterday creeping back in, heavy and unspoken. I wanted to shatter the silence, to ask him if he felt the same way about this strange tension that hung over everything we did. Before I could voice my thoughts, he looked up, his expression serious and almost somber. "I know things have been different lately," he began, his voice low. "And I don't know what to make of it either." Surprised by his candor, I met his gaze, feeling the same uncertainty reflected back at me. "Me neither," I admitted quietly, the words slipping out more vulnerably than I had intended. We sat there in silence, the air thick with unexpressed feelings. By the next evening, the awkwardness had started to dissipate, yielding to something more familiar. Perhaps it was the physical exhaustion or the sheer oddity of our spontaneous mountain hike, but it felt as though we had forged a fragile truce. I was still sore with every step, a constant reminder of how far I had pushed myself, but I didn't want to bring it up, especially not with him around. He would only tease me about it. In a burst of spontaneity, I suggested we check out the art gallery downtown, which was hosting an interactive exhibit I had seen advertised, a journey into the self, it promised. The concept sounded abstract, yet something about it drew me in. To my surprise, he agreed immediately. As we entered the galleries, the dim lighting and soft murmur of other visitors wrapped around us, creating a tranquil, almost reverent ambience. The main room was expansive, with lofty ceilings and wide-open spaces. The walls displayed peculiar installations that seemed to pulse and shift with the flickering lights. The experience was disorienting, akin to stepping into another person's dream where reality felt slightly skewed. He walked ahead of me, hands nestled in his pockets, his eyes thoughtfully examining each piece. I trailed behind, partly observing him and partly attempting to decipher the cryptic art. Odd shapes emerged and receded, shadows dancing as I changed my angle, making each installation appear different from various perspectives. It was both haunting and beautiful, perfectly reflecting the unusual tension that lingered between us. After wandering for a bit, we found ourselves in a room filled with mirrors, large, antique ones framed in dark wood that seemed to absorb the light. They reflected our images from every angle, creating infinite versions of ourselves in a mesmerizing array. Standing in the center, I felt tiny, almost swallowed by this sea of reflections. I glanced to my side and noticed his reflection beside mine, both of us suspended in that boundless mirrored space. "Isn't it strange?" he mused softly, his gaze locking onto mine in the glass. "Seeing yourself multiplied like this." "Yeah," I murmured, my voice scarcely above a whisper. "It's like looking at someone else entirely." Our eyes met again in the mirror, and for a fleeting moment, the world around us seemed to disappear. We stood there, caught in a loop of endless reflections, and a peculiar chill washed over me, a magnetic pull I couldn't quite explain. My heart raced, the silence thickening between us, charged with an energy I struggled to identify. Just then, someone else entered the room, their footsteps echoing off the mirrors, shattering the moment. I turned away quickly, feeling heat rise to my cheeks as I broke eye contact, pretending to examine the nearest mirror intently. He seemed to notice my discomfort, clearing his throat as he stepped back, creating a small but noticeable distance between us. We moved into the next room, both suddenly quiet, almost apprehensive in each other's presence. This room was darker, illuminated by softly glowing sculptures that cast long, distorted shadows across the walls. A few other visitors lingered nearby, whispering to one another, but it felt as though we were the only two people there. Our footsteps were the only sounds in the dim light as we paused before a piece that resembled an abstract swirl of glass and metal. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Are you okay?" The question took me by surprise, and for a moment, I wasn't sure how to respond. The past few days had left me feeling disoriented, as if I were perpetually questioning my own thoughts and emotions. But I nodded, forcing a small smile. "Yeah, I don't know. This place is pretty intense." He nodded, his expression softening. "Yeah, it's different." There was a shared understanding in his voice, as if he too felt the strange undercurrent in the air, though neither of us dared to articulate it. We stood in silence, each absorbed in our own thoughts, grappling with our inner turmoil. Eventually, we drifted to another corner of the room, where a bizarre, twisted sculpture seemed to morph and change shape under the shifting lights. For a moment, we were entranced, our faces illuminated by the pale glow of the piece. Then, unexpectedly, he reached over, brushing his fingers against mine. It was such a light touch that I might have thought it was unintentional. But he didn't withdraw. His fingers lingered, warm against my skin, and a thrilling jolt coursed through me, a strange, familiar excitement. Our eyes locked again, and this time, neither of us averted our gaze. There was no one else around, no distractions, just the quiet, electric tension building between us with each passing heartbeat. I felt my pulse quicken, my thoughts swirling in chaos, yet all I could focus on was the steady warmth of his hand against mine. Then, without a word, he leaned in and kissed me. It was brief, a mere brush of lips, but it sent a shock through my entire being, leaving me frozen, struggling to comprehend what had just transpired. We pulled apart, both breathing heavily, our eyes wide with a mix of shock and something deeper. For a moment, we simply stared at each other, the silence thick and charged. I could see the same confusion and longing reflected in his gaze, and it filled me with a strange fear. Finally, he stepped back, his hand slipping away as he looked down, his expression a jumble of emotions. "I'm sorry," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what just happened." I shook my head, struggling to find the right words. My mind swirled with feelings that didn't quite make sense. I wanted to reassure him, to let him know I felt it too. But the words wouldn't come. We stood there in silence, both of us trapped in our thoughts and confusion. The gallery around us felt colder, more distant, and the art pieces that had once seemed intriguing now felt alien, as if they were judging us. He turned and left the room, leaving me standing there alone. My heart raced, and my mind was a chaotic storm of emotions. I wanted to call after him, to tell him to wait, but something held me back. As I stood in that quiet, empty space, a wave of sadness washed over me. I realized then that whatever had begun between us was changing everything, and there was no turning back. The following morning, I awoke feeling the weight of the previous night pressing down on me. The silence in the apartment was oppressive, thick with unspoken words, and I sensed he was deliberately avoiding me. Whether out of regret, confusion, or something else entirely, I couldn't tell. I found him in the kitchen, staring out the window with that familiar distant expression I'd come to recognize but could never fully comprehend. When he noticed me, he turned and managed a strained smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. We stood there for a moment, neither of us speaking, both caught in the strange tension that had become our norm. "So, are we just going to pretend that last night didn't happen?" I finally asked, my voice softer than I intended, a tremor of hope and uncertainty woven into each word. He exhaled slowly, a look of sadness crossing his face. "I don't know what to say," he replied. "Maybe it's for the best." His words hit me like a blow, but I forced a nod, struggling to swallow the lump in my throat. I could see the regret in his eyes, the way he avoided my gaze, and it deepened the emptiness within me. Before I could stop myself, I reached out and took his hand, and to my surprise, he didn't pull away. We stood there, our fingers intertwined, enveloped in silence. The connection felt delicate, as though it could shatter with a single breath. But for that fleeting moment, it was enough. "Finally," he whispered, "we need to let this go.
Move on."
I nodded, though every fiber of my being resisted. I knew he was right. We had crossed boundaries, reached a point where we could never truly remain. But as he gently withdrew his hand and turned away, the ache inside me felt like a permanent scar. Months rolled by, and our lives fell into separate patterns, as if we had mutually agreed to erase that fragile, impossible bond. I immersed myself in work, creating plans and routines that felt safe and predictable. I almost convinced myself that I had moved on, that whatever spark had ignited between us was merely a product of close quarters, shared memories, and the echoes of our childhood. Yet, one afternoon, while walking home through familiar city streets, I caught sight of him. He stood outside the cafe we had visited that first night, hands tucked in his pockets, gazing out at the crowd with a faint, distant expression. My heart skipped a beat, and an old ache rose within me as I froze, watching him unnoticed. He seemed changed, perhaps a bit older, more withdrawn, as if he had faded into the background of his own life. Though I felt an overwhelming urge to approach him and say something, I remained rooted to the spot, wrestling with the part of me that still longed to bridge the impossible divide between us. Then, as if sensing my presence, he turned, and our eyes met across the bustling street. For what felt like an eternity, time stood still, leaving only the silent connection flowing between us. In his gaze, I saw a reflection of all we had been, all we could never be, and everything that still lingered, unspoken and unresolved. Without a word, he offered a faint, almost imperceptible nod, his eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't quite decipher, something that felt like both a farewell and a recognition of the bond we had tried to bury. Then he turned away, melting into the crowd, leaving me standing there with the painful realization that some connections leave scars too deep to heal. And some people, even if we part ways, never truly leave us.